Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the EU drug markets Cannabis in-depth analysis, a joint analysis by the EMCDDA and Europol. We're going to be talking this morning about the illicit cannabis market in the European Union. The module is available online already. You can see the QR code on the screen just now. And this module is the fourth comprehensive overview of its type. The analysis is based on the latest data and information from the EMCDDA's monitoring system and from Europol's operational information on serious and organised crime. And it describes the European market for cannabis products, from production and trafficking to distribution and use. It also provides details of the processes, materials, and criminal actors involved at different stages and levels of the cannabis market. This morning, we're going to take some time to guide you through the module, presenting some of the details. However, please note there's a lot of material online, and I encourage you to browse through it and interact with the data at your own convenience. All the data-driven figures and graphics are interactive, and you can download the data if you wish for your own purposes. We're going to have 4 speakers presenting this morning, and I'll introduce each of them before they speak. After the last speaker, if we have time, we'll open up the question and answer session, and I hope we can have some interesting questions posed by the audience. Please don't use the chat for questions. Please use the question and answer button because it makes the moderation a lot more simple. So before I introduce our first speaker, I'm going to provide a rapid overview of the key points of the report and what you can expect to find there. You'll see that the module is very detailed, so we've had to be selective about what we can present to you in this webinar format. Okay, let's see. Okay. What you can see on the screen just now is the interface of the module online, where you can navigate around the various chapters in the module. So let's dive straight in to the key findings. Cannabis is the most consumed illicit drug in Europe, with an estimated 22.6 million users that's reported in the last year, and they spend at least 11.4 billion euro on cannabis products in a year. It seems that the market is stable overall, but there are concerning developments. Recorded quantities of cannabis resin and herbal cannabis were seized in 2021, record numbers, and the number of cannabis plants seized is also at a very high level. There have been large increases in the level of delta-9 THC present in cannabis products, and this is what we use as a measure of potency. The delta-9 THC content of herbal cannabis has increased by 57% over the last 10 years, and the potency of resin has doubled. The criminal networks involved in the cannabis trade are characterized by their diversity, adaptability, and flexibility, and they are often involved in multiple stages of the process and multiple drug types. We assess that most of the herbal cannabis detected in the EU is cultivated in the EU, but countries of the Western Balkans remain a source of cannabis, though less important than they once were. Importantly, Spain is disproportionately affected by the cannabis market. Spanish authorities have made cannabis an operational priority, and due to their efforts, they've reported 75% of the total quantity of cannabis plants seized in the EU in 2021. Spain is also the key EU entry point for cannabis resin coming from Morocco, with over 650 tons seized in 2021. We're also highlighting in this report that the environmental impact of cannabis production is considerable due to the energy and water use, but also the chemical pollution that is caused. An increasing range of cannabis consumer products are available on the market, including oils, edibles, and vaping products, and some of these are highly potent. Some of them are made in the EU and others outside, and it's a concern also that what we are calling semi-synthetic cannabinoids have emerged onto the market. Things like delta-8 THC and HHC, hexahydrocannabinol, have emerged. and these are sold in a broad range of consumer products. In many instances, the effects on users of these products is untested and unknown. In addition, some of those products have been found to contain potent synthetic cannabinoids, and these pose a high risk to users' health, and fatal poisonings have been recorded in the EU. All of these developments are taking place while there is an ongoing policy debate in Europe and globally, which is impacting licit and illicit markets, leading to challenges for law enforcement and criminal justice systems. Now we're going to dig into some of the details behind the analysis, and we have a number of specialists lined up. After all the speakers have finished, we'll have time for some questions, and as I mentioned earlier, please use the Q&A tab or button on your screen at the bottom for this. The first speaker is Alina Arucsandei from Europol. Alina is a senior analyst in the strategic analysis team at Europol, and she will present some aspects of the criminal networks involved in the cannabis trade in the EU. Alina, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, for the floor. In the coming slides, I will briefly present several of the findings of our analytical efforts with this report with regard to the criminal networks that engage in cannabis trafficking in its multiple stages, from cultivation, importation, distribution to the final user markets. There is much to say about criminal networks. I think the discussion is a long one. In general, criminal networks involved in drugs trafficking have very interesting features that we've come to discover more closely in the past years with our findings. But today I will be focusing mostly on some of the features of these networks and some of the issues that pertain to their functioning, their roles, their processes, but also what are the enablers of criminal operations. So with that, one first point that I would like to mention is how adaptable and diverse the criminal networks involved in cannabis trafficking are. This concerns largely a multitude and a variety of criminal networks that are composed of multiple nationalities, both EU and non-EU. We see both local criminal networks that operate in their own country, but we also see criminals with other nationalities that operate in different countries, both, again, EU and non-EU, especially from countries that are perceived as important source countries for cannabis. One example is criminal networks comprised of nationals from the Western Balkan region, known as a source, as Andrew mentioned a bit earlier, known as a source for cannabis trafficked into the EU. For example, these criminal networks that originate or have links to the Western Balkan region, we've observed in the past years, also with the findings of our encrypted communications data, that they've strengthened their foothold on EU criminal markets, particularly in cannabis, where they deal both with cultivation, with importation, and distribution. Another example is the Moroccan origin criminal networks that operate in several key hubs for cannabis trafficking in the EU, more specifically in Spain, which is the closest country to Morocco from where cannabis resin is also imported. These criminal networks either control the entire chain of trafficking, from cultivation or importation to the street distribution, while others take up several stages, one or more, in the entire cycle of operations, of criminal operations. These criminal networks are also highly cooperative. This is particularly visible at wholesale level, where they share resources, they build partnerships, they provide or share services, they make use of each other's contacts and infrastructure, enabling them to participate in larger consignments, for example, where they can negotiate better prices. They organize jointly the transportation of the shipments. They form alliances to strengthen their position on the markets. They lend or send or sell their expertise to other criminal networks, for example, in the case of Dutch criminal networks that have been on the market for a long time. Another element that is worth mentioning with regard to the features of the criminal networks in cannabis trafficking is that they deal with both. Sometimes, in some cases, they deal with both herbal cannabis and resin cannabis, but they also deal with cannabis and other types of drugs, from heroin to cocaine to synthetic drugs in several instances. And it's not uncommon to see barters and exchanges for of one drug for another. For example, on the west part of the African coast, where we have routes from South America for cocaine into the EU, and proximity to cannabis resin production hubs in North Africa. In addition to drugs, these criminal networks occasionally, or some of them, deal with other criminal activities. Examples include property crime, migrant smuggling. Again, I'm referring to the example of migrant smugglers that operate in North Africa that use the same logistical infrastructure to move at the same time drugs and irregular migrants, and so on and so forth. Another element that characterizes, I believe, criminal networks involved in cannabis trafficking, and this spreads beyond to other types of drugs as well, is the variety of roles that we see in different stages, the fragmentation of these roles, and how clearly defined their tasks are, displaying once more how professional, how business shaped the entire environment is. This is seen at cultivation and production level, with specific individuals dealing with logistical arrangements, for example, finding, renting, setting up the appropriate spaces for the cultivation of cannabis. We see individuals specializing in the supply of equipment, the seeds and other raw materials, guarding the cultivation sites, those cultivating, cutting, or drying the plants, and those packaging and dispatching the loads of cannabis for further distribution. And in this distribution phase, again, we see individuals with specific roles, from those who negotiate the purchases with suppliers in the origin countries, to those who deal with the transportation of the drugs, sourcing again the vehicles, the boats, recruiting the facilitators and specialists, arranging the reception, the storage, protection of the drugs, taking countermeasures against law enforcement, operating as couriers, again in the transportation, and many, many more examples. I will pass on now to another key factor or element that is to be considered when looking at the criminal networks and the criminal environment. In the past years, we've seen criminal networks using and abusing a set of instruments and tools and contexts and situations to enable, to facilitate their operations. One of these, one element or pillar of this enabler section is the crime as a service dimension, which again has built up and grown into a full-on standalone parallel business industry that supplies the criminal networks that deal with the core profitable crimes with various services, various tools that they use to facilitate and to ease their operation, or to remain far from law enforcement intervention. In this particular case, we see brokers, for example, that connect multiple criminal networks at the same time, and who become high value targets. That's how we call them, become pivotal actors, and targeting such actors obviously would lead to dismantling or interrupting or halting the criminal operations of multiple other criminal networks. So they're very important. We see specialized service providers in terms of transportation, individuals, groups, or networks that specialize and provide as a service access to vehicles, for example, or access to companies and legal business structures that are then misused by criminals to again facilitate their operations. Another very important element in the crime as a service industry is the money laundering sector, where again we have criminal networks that are specializing in moving and in laundering the profits that cannabis traffickers make across jurisdictions. They have a wide network of collaborators spread across the globe in key hubs where the money can go and can be hidden from law enforcement. Another pillar of the enablers segment, as we call them, is the misuse of legal business structures. These companies are either infiltrated by criminals by means of intimidation or corruption, or are specifically set up for the purpose of their operations. companies are used to rent, to buy vehicles, to get access to these vehicles, to find and to recruit drivers or specialists for the cultivation sites. We have transport businesses and trade businesses that are used to operate the movement of the consignments and to conceal the nature of these illicit consignments. And with regard, coming back to the money laundering issue, we have cash intensive businesses used intensively by criminals to move illicit profits across the jurisdictions. Corruption, as you may have seen on the first slide or introductory slide, is again seen on all levels of society. Criminals make intensive use of this enabling activity. Uh, from port workers, from dock workers, from those guarding ports, for example, for airport employees or private flight companies, to IT specialists. These are all potential targets for criminals for corruption. We see also law enforcement a potential target, as well as local administration, home or farm owners, from, for example, also real estate agents. Their list is almost endless. The idea is that they take advantage of any opportunity to corrupt and to infiltrate so that they can carry out their operations. The last point I want to make here is on violence. As you may know, some of you, we've seen in the past years in some member states increasing levels of violence. From the drugs area, I believe cocaine and cannabis are the two drugs that where we see most violence, particularly on the distribution level. The violence is a more complex concept because it's on one side an impact of organized crime, but it's also an enabler because it allows the criminal networks to remain competitive, to remain on the markets. Competition, as I said, is mostly seen on the distribution level because on the wholesale level, we see more of a cooperative engagement between the criminal networks and more of a business-oriented environment. We've seen violence at street level in several countries that are perceived as hubs for cannabis trafficking. We've seen it in the Netherlands, we've seen it in Belgium, we've seen it in France, in Sweden, and so on. And violence is not only reflecting street clashes, but can also go to extreme lengths like murder or torture. And sometimes, in the case of some criminal networks, it becomes part of the business model of the criminal networks at hand. I will move now. Let's see if it works. Yeah. From my side, one last slide, which is an example of sophistication and how quickly criminal networks can adapt to innovation, to developments in their external environment, to changes in the policy, and so on and so forth. We know that trafficking of cannabis resin from Morocco to Spain and to the EU further is carried out in multiple ways, and criminals have been very inventive in finding new transportation methods, new concealment methods. We've seen cannabis resin moved, for example, in lorries loaded on ferries. We've seen it in recreational and fishing boats, as well as in small helicopters or private airplanes, but also passenger flights. Very inventive. In the past, we've also seen unmanned aerial vehicles or the drones being used by criminals to move drugs across the border. And one interesting aspect that we've seen with one operation that was carried out by Spanish authorities in 2022 was the discovery for the first time, as much as we know, of a unmanned submersible vehicle. So basically a submarine that was controlled remotely. It was one of them in the building phase, and it was being prepared to be camouflaged at sea. It was equipped with GPS and radio signal and propulsors so that it would have an autonomy of several hours and could be controlled from a distance of around 30, 40 kilometers. The drone itself had costed an estimation of around 50,000 euro. However, this price for this investment by criminal networks in one item seems very small, considering that that particular drone could have carried between 100 150 and 200 kilograms of cannabis in one go. So counting that, I think it makes a good investment from the criminal perspective. With that, I end my intervention. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give the floor back to Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Alina. That was very clear and an interesting example that you presented at the end there. Shows you some of the things that are going on with the innovation in this in the trafficking sphere. If anyone has questions for anything that Alina said, please use the Q&A button as I mentioned earlier. Our next speaker this morning is Robert Patrancus. Robert is a scientific analyst working in our drug markets and crime team here at the EMCDDA, and Robert has a special focus on the Western Balkan region. And he's going to lead us through various elements of the trafficking chapter of our analysis. Robert, over to you, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. I'm happy to be here today and present you in the next 3 slides insights about the quantities of herbal cannabis and resin seized in Europe, and also about the herbal cannabis sourced outside the EU. On the screen, you can see a chart about the total herbal cannabis seized in EU, Norway, and Turkey between 2011 and 2021. When looking only at the EU data, we see that the quantities seized reached record levels in 2021, amounting 256 tons, and this represents definitely an all-time record. If we add also the quantity reported by Turkey and Norway, both are not EU, but are part of EMCDDA and part of routine data collection, we have another record, which is 288 tons seized. Based on the available evidence, we see that only a small number of countries account for a large proportion of the total amount of herb seized in EU. Spain, it is the blue area on the chart, reported the largest quantity in 2021, confiscating 130 tons, and this represents about 51% of the EU total. So Spain alone seized more than half of the total quantity at EU level. Also Italy, 47 tons, and France, almost 40 tons, seized together more than a third of the EU total. The pattern of seizures being more prevalent in some countries is likely to factors such as the location on major trafficking routes, large consumer markets, or the scale of illicit production. Similar to the previous slide, the chart on the screen displays the quantity of cannabis resin seized in EU, Norway, and Turkey for a period of 10 years. Comparing the two main cannabis products, the resin seized in EU was more than 3 times that of herbal cannabis in 2021. Observing only the EU data, about 816 tons of resin were seized in 2021, which represent the largest quantity seized since 2008, when over 900 tons were seized. If we add also the quantity reported by Turkey and Norway, we have another record, which is 850 tons. About the countries that seized the largest quantity, I think that the chart is very clear. Spain reported over 670 tons of resin in 2021, and this represents over 82% of the EU total of the year. Why is this situation? It's simple, and I think it was already mentioned. Most of the cannabis resin available on the European market comes from Morocco, and due to its geographical location, Spain is the main entry point in EU. After Spain, the largest seizures of resin in the EU were reported by France and Italy, confirming their role as important entry points. However, and this is quite important, it's important to note that some of the resin seized in France and Italy may actually have transited Spain first. Also, there may have been some diversification in the trafficking routes in the last few years. For instance, some recent data indicates that fairly large amounts of resin were seized in other countries in 2022, such as in Greece. Turkey, which seized 33 tons in 2021, may also be an entry point for resin in Europe. Cannabis is produced globally, but when we speak about the herbal cannabis in EU, most of it appears to be cultivated in the EU. The Western Balkan region, in particular Albania, has long been important in the supply of herbal cannabis in the EU, but the situation today has become more diverse and complex, with much less quantities trafficked to EU than in the past. Less outdoor cannabis was produced in the region. There was a decrease of seizures since 2018, as can be noted on the chart on the screen. More Western Balkans reported large cultivation sites, and this indicates a shift in cannabis cultivation in the region. These changes seem linked also to the eradication efforts in Albania, where aerial monitoring operations have been undertaken in cooperation with the Italian Guardia di Finanza for a decade. Also, this region has expanding its role, supplying herbal cannabis also to Turkey. As part of these changes, to be closer to the main consumer markets, some of the Western Balkan criminal networks have adapted a new business model, and they involve in cannabis cultivation and trafficking inside the EU, for example, in Spain, in Belgium, in France, in Austria, and these are just examples. Interestingly, for more profit, some of these networks also engage in the trafficking of cocaine to Europe. Notably, and this is the last point on Western Balkans, North Macedonia legalized cannabis production for medical use in 2016, and some of the legally produced cannabis was diverted to the illicit market, large quantities being stolen from their warehouses or illicit production being undertaken inside the licensed facilities. Very recently, also Albania legalized the cannabis production for medical use. Some of the herbal cannabis produced in Americas, in Southeast Asia or West Africa was trafficked to Europe. However, in the recent years, they are no longer reported as major sources. As a very interesting fact, there seems to have been an increase in the frequency of herbal cannabis traffic from Canada and US recently. The quantities appear to remain at low level. However, at least 2 containers from Canada containing large shipments of cannabis herb were seized recently in the EU. And the last point from my side, it should be noted that Morocco, the major source of resin on the European market, has recently been reported as a source of herbal cannabis by several EU member states. So we may see a diversification of products from Morocco. Thank you so much for your attention. Andrew, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Interesting details there about the trafficking situation within the EU and in the sources of cannabis and, well, herbal cannabis and cannabis resin from outside the EU. Now we turn to Tim Simons, another analyst working on drug markets and crime at the EMCDDA. Tim will be presenting on the aspects of cannabis production. Tim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I will just take you through some data we have collected on cannabis production in the EU, and I will also shed some light on environmental impacts and carbon footprints of cannabis production as well. So first of all, in herbal cannabis is mainly produced for sale on domestic markets rather than for exports. But estimating total cannabis production in Europe is rather difficult due to currently limited systematic monitoring of illicit cannabis cultivation sites, including the number and the size of them that are being dismantled in Europe each year. The use of our data collection tool on reporting cannabis cultivation sites developed by EMCDDA and Europol has been rather limited up till today. However, we also collect data through open source information, as well as through ad hoc information requests through supply experts from our member states, as well as our different networks. And we at least could make an estimation of the number of sites detected. So for instance, for 2019, we had by 14 member states about 7,000 cannabis cultivation sites dismantled. The year after, in 2020, it was already 10,000, also reported by 14 member states. And in 21, it was about 9,000 dismantled sites reported by 13 member states. Due to the incomplete reporting, we cannot say anything about the size of these cannabis cultivation sites, either if they were indoor or outdoors. However, recent messages indicate that there are quite some large-scale cultivation sites being detected in the EU recently. When we take a look at the graphic of the slide, we can take a look at cannabis plant seizures in the EU, which is one of the key indicators we are able to monitor consistently. We see in 2021 that more than 4.3 million cannabis plants were seized in the EU, and also that Spain accounted for about 75% of the total. So more or less 3.2 million plants seized, representing almost a twofold increase from 2020. We must note, however, that Spain in the last couple of years has prioritized cannabis cultivation. So this is also probably a reflection of their efforts by law enforcement agencies, as well as the fact that countries traditionally reporting quite a number of plant seizures, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, have reported less big seizures in the last few years. What is not on the slide is that the country seizing the most cannabis plants in 2021 was Turkey. They seized about 76 million cannabis plants, which is about 18 times more than the total for the entire EU. So when we discuss cannabis production, it's also good to shed a bit of light on environmental impacts and carbon footprint of this production. Actually, because of regulated markets globally, we are getting more and more access to data on production and what it has for impact on our climate and on our environment. So when we look on environmental impacts, the main one, especially for indoor cultivation, is consumption of energy, which is reflected by use of lighting, climate control, and also water pumping, and so on. For example, to produce 1 kilogram of herbal cannabis indoors, it requires about 6,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, equaling about 1,400 kilos of carbon footprint. If you compare it with outdoor cultivation, the energy used there is mainly by agricultural equipment and more indirectly with the production of fertilizers and pesticides. To give an example of this energy use, especially indoor, for 2021, the Dutch electricity network provider made an estimation of the electricity stolen for that year for cannabis production in particularly, and it was estimated to be about 1 billion kilowatt hours, and that equals the annual household use of electricity for a Dutch city such as Rotterdam. You could compare it as well with the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, or Athens in Greece. So we take a look at the second environmental impact, which is water use. Cannabis is a crop that requires quite some water, quite similar to crops such as soy and maize. For outdoor cultivation, one cannabis plant requires about 19 to 21 liters of water every day. When you take into account that you have 150 days for an outdoor growing cycle, that is quite some water. To highlight this with an example, in 21 in Spain, there was a outdoor cultivation site dismantled with about 400,000 cannabis plants. When we take the factors into account, this accounted for one harvest cycle to about 1.8 billion liters of water consumed, which equals more or less the daily water consumption in a country like Latvia for 3 days. Indoor cannabis cultivation requires less water, around between 9 and 11 liters per plant. Of course, the difference is that indoor cultivation can go out 365 days a year. Another interesting fact about it is that more recently we see more and more appliances being used indoors for cooling the environment, which are also making use of water. So actually, not only the plants are using the water, but now more and more also the equipment that's being used indoors. Further, we also have pesticide use, water pollution, and air pollution. Those are actually factors that are also common with traditional agriculture, so that does not differ too much. There's still a lot to know about it. There are still a lot of knowledge gaps, but slowly we are trying to fill them in. For example, a recent study on air pollution found out that the terpenes of cannabis in outdoor cultivation were excreting a particle that was actually impacting ozone concentrations in the air. This is all still very limited, but we still have a lot to research. Last one is land cover change, of course, mainly with outdoor cultivation. For instance, to produce 1 kilo of outdoor grown cannabis, you require about deforestation, about 4 square meters of land, which equals about 20 kilos of carbon footprint. So in total, if we take all the data together, the carbon footprint of indoor cannabis cultivation is estimated to be 16 to 100 times larger than outdoor cultivation. For one joint of 0.3 grams of herbal cannabis, you have to drive about 70 meters with a hybrid plug-in vehicle, and for a joint from indoor grown cannabis, it's about 4.6 kilometers. We still have a lot to research, we still have a lot to find out, but in the future we will have access to more and more data, so we hope to fine-tune these analyses in the future. That's it from my side. I give the floor back to Andrew.
Thanks a lot, Tim, for giving us those details about cannabis production and about the environmental impact of cannabis in the EU. Finally, I'd like to turn to our last speaker. It is Laurent Laniel. Laurent is a principal scientific analyst working in our team on drug markets and crime at the EMCDDA, and he was the lead author on this analysis. Laurent will be discussing the findings on the detailed retail end of the drug market, the cannabis market, and we'll also cover some of the actions that have been identified in this work for countering the threats that have been identified related to illicit cannabis markets. Laurent, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everyone. I'm waiting for my computer to be given the voila now. So yes, in for retail markets for cannabis products. Quite a diverse. You've heard Alina earlier about the diverse picture concerning organized crime. The changes on the actual retail market may be even more diverse and complicated. Here you have the main factors that I'm going to touch upon in the remainder of the presentation. We have higher potency. I'll show you a graph that is quite impressive due to new strains being introduced or potent strains being used to produce cannabis in Europe. better techniques to actually cultivate them and extract products from them. One of the key highlights of this report is the vast range of different consumer products now available, which we are now getting away from the old hash plus weed model of the past, and now we have vapes, edibles, oils, extracts that are becoming available to consumers in different amounts as far as our indicators can allow us to judge. We, on top of the different products, we also have different methods of administrating these products by the consumers. We have low and high THC products, we have semi-synthetic, we have cannabinoids, we have synthetic cannabinoids that are traded in different ways, online, offline, using apps, using marketing techniques, which I'll tell you about in a bit more detail in a minute. What we also find it's a bit more concerning is adulteration of herbal material with, supposedly THC marijuana adulterated with dangerous synthetic cannabinoids. Sometimes this is sold to consumers without telling them that what they're buying is not natural cannabis, but it is natural cannabis plus adulteration with these potent and potentially quite dangerous for health substances. Just a picture to explain that as Andrew already said, the European cannabis market seems to be stable, but at a high level, 22.6 million people using cannabis. This is the largest number of people using illicit drugs in Europe, followed by cocaine, which is only 3.5 million, I believe. So you can see the difference. The second drug is used by 6 times less people than cannabis. The market is stable, both in geography and in time. Some of the drugs you see a spike of consumption during weekends or when there are music festivals. For cannabis, there seems to be very little geographical and temporal variations across the week. The picture here, the little map, is to illustrate a wastewater analysis exercise that was performed in 2021 in 23 cities. As you can see, most of the cities are concentrated in Central Europe, and this is why all the dots are concentrated there. But apart from Germany, we assess that the largest market for cannabis are also the most populated countries in the EU, and most of them are in Western Europe, such as France, Italy, Germany, Spain. This is what I was telling you about earlier, a trend analysis of the potency of cannabis, of the 2 main cannabis products, herbal and resin, reported to the EMCDDA between 2011 and 21. So these are 2011 is 100, and to see the percentage increase over 10 years. So the herbal THC content of, on average, reported by all our member states, which are, I think, 27 EU plus 2, Turkey and Norway, so 29 countries. Herbal cannabis, according to this data, has increased by 57%, so almost 60% in 10 years. And cannabis resin THC content potency has increased by almost 200%, 191%, i.e. it has almost doubled in 10 years. And this starting from 2011, which already recorded a hike, an increase in the potency of resin from previous years. So we have quite a clear trend here towards this increase. As I was saying earlier, this is likely due to the resin increase due to improvements of the plant or the techniques used to extract resin in Morocco, and the use of much more productive and higher THC containing plants to produce the resin back in Morocco, as well as, although our data is not fit to illustrate that properly, I would say, probably also production within the EU. We know this already happens for some years. In the Netherlands, for example, they sell neither hash in the coffee shops, but probably elsewhere as well, of very high potency hashish cannabis resin within the EU based on the domestic crops that we cultivate in the EU, many of which are also high potency, high yield plants. Another news is something that we have introduced last year in our monitoring is the affordability calculation of the price of drugs. So affordability reflects what a drug actually costs, corrected for purity or potency in this case, in the context of the living standards of a given country. So to take an example, with 20 euros in Sweden, you can buy perhaps 2 beers, perhaps 3. In Bulgaria or Romania or in other countries, you can buy 10. So it's not the same to spend 20 euros across Europe. And this indicator shows that in the context of, in the case of resin, 12 countries, and in the case of herbal cannabis, 16 member states, how more affordable, in fact, cannabis has become. You can see on the slide, resin 25% more affordable, so 25%, your money goes 25% further than you used to buy a resin, and 20% further to buy herb. So overall, cannabis is cheaper, more accessible to consumers, according to this partial data, which is about only half or a third of the member states. Another thing that we need to become aware now of the European cannabis market, the old world, as I was saying, was about resin and herb, which meant really natural phytocannabinoids, the delta-9 THC that everyone knows, the CBD that everyone, I suppose, now also knows, which is a bit more recent. But nowadays, we need also to become aware of the semi-synthetic cannabinoids, the delta-8 THC, the delta-10, which have been found mostly in the US, the HAC and the HAC acetate, the HACO. So these are relatively new products. You can see on the slide that they are made probably from CBD, more than probably, actually, almost certainly from CBD. And then we have these other cannabinoids on the market, which may be sold as such or may be used to adulterate other products, such as ADB, Butinaca, etc., etc. I won't try to pronounce them all because it's quite difficult. But the point of this slide is to show you that in terms of products and in terms of active principles of what affects the brain or not of users, we now need to deal with and to monitor and to maybe provide healthcare to people who use different types of cannabinoids, and these can combine, as I will try to show you, in the products that are sold to the consumers. So these new, fairly new synthetic, semi-synthetic cannabinoids, the point of them is to understand that they are made from CBD. They are made within the plant already from CBD, but in very tiny amounts. Well, some of them are made within the plant from CBD, but in tiny amounts. But what the plant makes, you can make also in the lab. And so if you have large amounts of CBD extracts, you can convert it into HAC, for example, or delta-8 or delta-10 in the lab, and obtain a substance that you can then sell, which may or may not be illicit, depending on which market you're operating on within the EU or at global level. But the point is that now CBD has become a precursor. And the second point is that the impact on health of these products, which have been known for 80 years or something already in chemistry, their synthesis has been first performed in the 1940s, I think, in the US. But they haven't been used. So now that more people use them, we need to become a bit more conversant with what health effects they may have on people. And this we don't know yet. Another point is that the CBD, why suddenly did people decide to manufacture these new semi-synthetic extracts from CBDs? Because there was an overproduction of CBD, probably in the US, maybe also in Canada, and that people invested money in producing CBD cannabis and then couldn't sell it on the market. And so they sent it or made extracts out of it, concentrate it, create new products, and not lose all their investments, or maybe even make a profit. Jumping to another chapter, which you must bear in mind that this is one way in which things are made available to consumers, but these things can contain alternatively or in combinations the cannabinoids that I explained earlier. So we have now concentrates. We've had them for a while already, such as BHO, but butane hash oil, rosin wax, which are a bit more recent as being used, although we already had identified them in our previous markets report published in 2019. Some of these we think in Europe are made from the users themselves. Perhaps most of these, I'm not sure if I should say that because we do not have data to tell one way or another, but some are definitely commercially manufactured for sale to consumer, so by people who are active on the illicit market, so probably organized crime people, or they are imported from jurisdiction in North America where these products are illicit. And there have indeed been big seizures, several dozen of kilos of rosin or wax at airports in the EU that were coming from the United States. The second type of product, so these products, you mostly use them by dabbing, which is a new form of inhaling fumes or vapes of vapor of THC. Another form is to eat THC in this case, but also again other cannabinoids, the famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, edibles, which have become very popular in the US, and they are legally manufactured there, although we've become aware that there are also people making counterfeit edibles in the US. So the US market has bona fide, if you like, illicitly made products, hopefully with quality control, good quality control procedures in place, but you have people making bootleg ones to sell presumably cheaper to consumers. In Europe, these edibles are mostly sold on the darknet markets by social media, but also apparently you can find them at street level from dealers. It is difficult to estimate how many or how prevalent these edibles are in Europe at the time, because simply we're not equipped yet to properly monitor them. This is one of the problems posed by this diversification and complexification of the retail market in Europe, is that our indicators are mostly focused on resin and herb, also on traditional oil, but not really on the new product. So it's difficult to estimate the size. One thing that we cannot not mention is that between 20 and 2022, there were THC edibles with a large concentration or a high amount of THC in the edibles that were seized in Europe, and that some people, children particularly, were poisoned as a result of eating them. Another concerning development and dangerous development is that some of these edibles are made from, in fact, synthetic cannabinoids, which first of all have been seized, so we know it exists, and secondly are also very dangerous products, particularly to children. And why do I keep mentioning children? Because you can see on the pictures that these products will be appealing to a small kid. So if the parents or the environment is not careful, and the children may come across these, they may eat them and then potentially have very, very serious consequences on their health, including death, I'm afraid. So my computer refuses to move on for some reason. Now it does. Another type of products, the vaping family, if you like. So you have both e-liquids that you can use in your own electronic cigarettes, and ready-made little cigarettes that you've probably seen in American movies or series that also have become available in Europe, mostly smuggled from the US. Probably some of them are made also in the EU. So the vaping products, again, can be missold as THC or CBD, but in fact contain dangerous synthetic cannabinoids. They can also contain HHC, HHCO. These apparently were first developed in North America, where they became unpopular. And in the summer of 2019, there was an outbreak of deaths in the US. 70 people, 68 actually, died after using a vaping product that had been contaminated, with vitamin E acetate. This was called the Evali episode. Again, bootleg product that, turned out to be dangerous for health. So that's one of the also the consequences of this diversification, is that it's increasingly difficult to make the difference between what is being sold, and for consumers it's mostly impossible, depending on your relation perhaps with the person selling it to you, whether you trust them or not. But you may be sold stuff that is really very dangerous. HHC is definitely available in Europe. It has been seized. It's been sold by websites based in Europe and shipping to Europe. Depending on the country where you live, it may or may not be controlled by the authorities. Another interesting fact about the cannabis retail market is that we do this EU European Web Survey on Drugs, the EWSD, and we did one in 2021 where we were quite surprised. So cannabis is the drug most reported by those who answered the survey, and about a fourth of them, 25% of them, said that they obtain herbal cannabis for free. They didn't buy it. It was just given to them, or they cultivated it, or somehow didn't spend money to obtain cannabis herb, which I thought it was something that should be highlighted. So it's organized crime is making a lot of money with cannabis, but there's also a share of the market which apparently is not resorting to these networks. This was a survey in Amsterdam of a lot less people, but still people going to coffee shops in Amsterdam were asked about how they obtained their cannabis, and 21.2% said they got it for free. And the same picture basically applies to cannabis resin, which in my view is even more surprising, since cannabis resin, you have to make it, you have to invest some work, more so than marijuana. And so, but people still apparently are happy to share it for free. Another feature of the market is the increasing use of the social media platforms to advertise and sell cannabis products, illicit products. So they promote drug sales. They use a range of marketing techniques with some nice photos or edited videos. I've got several examples on my computer to advertise themselves to their clients. They are also these influencers who promote cannabis products and the use of these products to their followers. This is particularly the case on Instagram. And we think that this may be a broader push towards commercializing cannabis and attempting to sell both licensed and unlicensed products to a mainstream audience, as well as putting some pressure or some form of indirect lobbying on the policy debates that are going on around Europe. People, dealer networks can use marketing techniques and methods borrowed from licit trade, licit commerce, licit business sales, such as regressive pricing. So the more you buy, the less 1 gram costs, or buy 2, get 1 for free. They edit menus, sometimes very shiny with very attractive pictures, very well made. They use special packaging. You can buy some of those. Maybe I shouldn't say that online, but you can buy some of those on Alibaba, for example. Some networks have developed elaborate brand identities. For example, in France, there's a network called Caliweed, which has a lot, is quite well known on the internet for its advertisements, for its job recruitment. So they and it's not the only one. I'm just giving that example. The marketing techniques may be used to appeal to younger users, obviously. They and recruit young people into using cannabis, and they may also be related to changes in the legislation and the increase of outlets for CBD cannabis and low THC products, which is a legitimate enterprise in Europe, and which create its own advertising strategies and methods. And so perhaps illicit actors on the illicit market for cannabis are copying these techniques. One word about darknet. I think cannabis is the drug most traded on darknets. Darknets have quite a small share of the overall market, but they're still around. And this is just to illustrate which are the countries from which sellers on darknet claim to be shipping. So Germany, France, Netherlands, and Spain are the most frequently mentioned shipping countries by the people selling cannabis products, or in this case resin, but it's largely the same for herb on darknet markets. And now I am going to take you through the actions that we have come up with our Europol colleagues. There are very broad recommendations to policymakers and professionals with a stake in the cannabis market, or in controlling or somehow regulating this market in Europe. So we have built this action around 5 big pillars: to improve the intelligence picture, strengthen the responses, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in the remainder of the presentation, strengthening international cooperation, invest in capacity building, so training people here in Europe as well as in our international partner countries, and strengthen policy, public health and safety responses. But I'm going to go through the responses to reduce supply and enhance security quite quickly. I think Alina has already made some mention of that. We need to be to strengthen our responses to the criminal networks. Cannabis is sometimes less of a priority in Europe than perhaps it should be, given the amount of money it generates for organized crime and what this money is used for: corrupting people, buying weapons, increasing violence, etc. We should make use of what exists in Europe, joint investigation frameworks. They have various names: operational task forces at Europol, JITs at Eurojust, which are very useful when you deal with people operating across several legal jurisdiction within Europe. We need, as Alina said, to prioritize investigations against these high-value targets, that is, individuals who play a key role and who can make things happen for a lot of criminal organizations across the continent or in a particular region of Europe. And so if you manage to arrest those, there is significant disruption on the wholesale trafficking, at least of the cannabis trade in Europe. Of course, target money laundering. This is easier said than done, but it is really something that Europe needs to get very serious about, taking the money away, understanding how people launder the money, and managing to disrupt those networks of money launderers is really key. Strengthen public partnerships, because in the cannabis market, as well as in other drug markets, legal business structures are increasingly abused, used, either set up or being hijacked by criminals to further the cannabis trade. You can see here transport companies, post and parcel services, real estate firms, other enterprises, businesses, firms that need to, where we need to have more interaction with and try to gain their cooperation to enhance the security. Same with front companies, especially those that provide assistance and equipment for the production of cannabis. And that's it for me. I give the floor back to Andrew. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Laurent. That was a very interesting rundown on the retail markets and some of the recommendations. And I say just some of the recommendations that we've made here in this report. Of course, jointly with Europol. Normally, we're not making recommendations as such in EMCDDA reports, but this is a special report where we get a chance to do that. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's been necessary to be selective in what we've chosen to present to you today. You'll find a lot more details and discussion within the module itself. And you'll see that we've even introduced a search capability to the module so you can take a shortcut to the topics that interest you. I see the chat's been going quite rapidly, and some of the questions that have been raised have been already answered there. There have been a lot of questions posed in the Q&A part of the webinar, and I'd like to thank everybody for their interest there. We are very happy that we've got so many questions. However, we won't be able to answer all of them, and we're going to strictly stick to the topic of today's webinar, which is the illegal market. So we're not going to be answering questions about legalization, decriminalization, monitoring those type of markets, because that's not within the scope of this webinar. Some of that material is covered in EMCDDA publications. And I know that my colleague Brendan Hughes has shared links to the previous reports on that, on the policy situation, and a link to the questions about CBD were also answered in the chat. But we do have time for a few questions. So I'd like to start maybe with a question to Alina from Europol. In the chat, there was a question about in the past, there were some criminal networks that were exploiting sometimes laborers or young people as part of cannabis cultivation. Is that still going on? Is it linked to the trafficking of human beings? Could you give us some thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, we've seen in the past in cannabis cultivation in the EU signals and even cases where we had confirmation from law enforcement authorities in the countries that there was exploitation of individuals in the cultivation sites. And to answer your question, based on more recent information that arrived in Europol, such cases continue to emerge. Overall, the general element that should be stated is that in these cases, limited that have been shared with Europol, we're talking about non-EU criminal networks that operate here in the member states and that usually exploit their own nationals or nationals from the same region they originate from. I hope that clarifies.
Thanks a lot, Alina. I noticed another question that was in the chat. Explain what qualifies as a semi-synthetic cannabinoid, how it differs from synthetic cannabinoids, and are synthetic, semi-synthetics, are they just more adulterated with synthetic cannabinoids? I'll take this question myself because I think Laurent mentioned it, and there's quite a nice infographic in the module. From what we've seen, we believe that many of those semi-synthetic cannabinoids are made by chemically modifying natural cannabinoids, which are already in the plant. And Laurent mentioned the case of CBD. We believe that some of the delta-8 THC and the HHC that is on the products are appearing in the products on the European market and other places have been derived from CBD. So we're calling these products which are derived from natural cannabinoids, we're calling them semi-synthetic cannabinoids. So they're quite different from the synthetic cannabinoids that we've seen on the drug markets for maybe the last 15 years or so. All of those ones that started off JWH 018, HU, whatever they were, AM2201, all of those synthetic cannabinoids are really nothing to do with the cannabis plant. They interact with the cannabinoid system, and they interact with the CB1 and CB2 receptor systems, but they're really not linked to the plant at all. Whereas those semi-synthetic cannabinoids are related in some way to the natural cannabinoids present in the plant. There was a question in the chat, can EMCDDA and Europol data be used for research and educational purposes? That's one of the reasons we do our analysis. And of course, the information that we present is open access. You can use it in your teaching materials, you can use it for your own research. I mentioned earlier, the data behind all the data-driven graphics is available to download on our website. You can get to that data within a few clicks, and the data graphics themselves are interactive. There was a question in the chat about cannabis resin seizures from West Africa, and I think I'd like to ask Alina if there are instances of cases. I can't remember seeing it in any of the data that we have at the EMCDDA in recent times. Alina, do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I'm on the same page with you on our side as well. We haven't seen recent pieces of information regarding seizures arriving from West African countries. In our view, these countries are mostly used as transit zones in terms of cannabis products. For example, with cannabis going from North African countries towards South America, the barters and the exchanges that I mentioned during my slides. But no, that doesn't mean, however, that such cases may not exist, because Europol, as far as we are concerned, we receive fragmented information only on investigations that the member states or our partners require support from our side. So we don't have the full picture.
Thanks a lot, Alina. For the next question, I'd like to turn to Laurent, if I may. And this question is from Martin Gelsma. Are there estimates about the share of resin on the market in different countries as compared to herbal? And with regard to herbal, the percent imported versus domestic production? Laurent, can you take this one, please?
Yes, I can take this one. Not that we know of. What we have concluded based on our data is that the point at which the herbal market became more, where there were more users of cannabis herb than of resin in Europe as a whole, was 2012, when we saw a number of seizures of both products invert themselves. So there were more seizures of herb and than there were of resin. We may be able to, at a later stage, it wasn't mentioned here, but the EMCDDA is going to transform itself into a bigger agency and with more resources and resources in general to do forensic work on the products, illicit drug products available in Europe. So we may become able in future, we already have a pilot project on that, to determine the provenance by forensic profiling, so very strong evidence of where cannabis resin was made. For example, a sample seized can be analyzed, and you can say, well, this was made very likely from Morocco, from Lebanon, or in northwestern Europe, or in southeastern Europe, or maybe even more precisely. But at that time, I don't think we can be that precise. What we can say is that there are markets where cannabis resin survived better than in others, if you like, in terms of this switch that I was mentioning earlier, where herb became more popular at one point than resin. And those are France, Italy, and Spain, and Portugal. At least those I know off the top of my head, where resin is still strong. But I think that even those is probably more users of herb than there are of hash. So there are things that we can do, but there are things that we cannot do yet, and there are also others. It's going to be very tricky to have a breakdown by country of the provenance of the products that are used, at least from the EMCDDA. Maybe our member states can have programs to go into this and to explore these type of interesting information actually at the member state level.
Thanks a lot, Laurent. And I think what you're alluding to there, and I'm sure many people that are listening can understand this, what we're trying to do here is study an illicit market. We're studying a hidden behavior. So clearly, we don't have the full picture of what's going on. What we do is we collect data on lots of different aspects of the markets. We go together with Europol, and we try to understand, we put that data together with the reports, the cases, and we try to understand what's going on in the market. But it's not easy. There are limitations, clearly. But what you will find in a report is our best analysis based on all the information, data, and expert opinion that goes into this analysis. I should also say that as well as EMCDDA and Europol, we have consulted this report with our expert networks in the member states. So other experts have contributed to this analysis as well. I think we've got time for maybe one more question, a couple of questions. And I'd like to ask Robert if he wouldn't mind answering this one. And it's about the diversion of legally grown cannabis into the illicit market. You mentioned it, Robert, during your presentation, and the questioner asks, are there no rigid controls when it comes to illicit production?
Thank you so much for the question. First, I hope everybody will read the report. Actually, the answer is there. In North Macedonia, we noted actually two methods to misuse the legalization of cannabis. And the first one is actually a very simple one, stealing the cannabis from the warehouses of the legal factories. For example, I think in around December 2020, over 2 tons of cannabis were stolen from warehouses of licensed companies in 2 separate incidents. So we're speaking about quite significant quantities, at least 2 tons. Also, another method is producing illegal cannabis inside the legal facilities. And I think that in 2021, police seized about 1.5 tons of undeclared cannabis from a legally registered company. Of course, there is monitoring and control. There are many licensed companies that were closed and the licenses withdrawn. I don't have now the exact number, but I think that this year in North Macedonia, around 20 licenses were withdrawn by the authorities. But of course, this doesn't mean that the criminal networks don't find way to exploit this and make profit. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robert. That's clear. And as Robert said, that you'll find the detail to many of these, or the answers to many of these questions that have shown up in the module itself. So please go and take a look at that. There was a question at the very beginning of the Q&A from our friend and colleague Istvan Ujvari. Nice to see that you're tuning in, Istvan. And the question was, any data on the production of legal cannabis for research and medical purposes? And what I'd like to say is that, I mean, several questions that were asked in the Q&A and in the chat related to this topic. And just to say, at the current time, we're not monitoring this in any way. It's not within the the mandate of the EMCDDA or Europol to monitor that. So it's not something we collect data in, so we can't answer any of those questions. It's time to wrap up. And so I'd like to thank you for using your valuable time to follow the launch of this EU drug market cannabis in-depth analysis. I hope you're going to find this material that we've put online, we've made available. We hope you're going to make it useful for your own work, your own purposes. Finally, I'd like to thank the team behind the scenes responsible for producing this analysis and bringing everything together for this launch. There was a lot of work went into this, and it feels like a long gestation, and we've just given birth to a beautiful baby. And with that, I will close this webinar, and I hope to see you all next time. Have a good day.